Welcome to the High Pass Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Blackburn, and today we've got a very special guest, our friend Elio DeLuca of the Soul Shop in Medford, Massachusetts. But first, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's given me feedback in the last week on our first episode. These waters are very new for me, and your patience and kind words mean the world. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to present these conversations to you. If you have any thoughts, comments, suggestions, or complaints, please go to highpasspodcast.com and click on the contact form to send me a message. Now, I don't want to take too much time here before my conversation with Elio, so let's get started. Elio has an incredible resume as a musician, composer, arranger, engineer, mixer, and producer. His list of credits is as vast as the list of wonderful things all of his clients have to say about working with him. Elio, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really been looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me, man. Looking forward to it as well.
Absolutely. So what are some things that you're doing these days?
It's been a lot of mix work this year. For some reason, everything I worked on in 2022 and right beforehand, 2021, 22, a lot of projects kind of came to fruition at the end of 2022. So I was in just mixing and mastering mode, reviewing masters for like the first 3-4 months of the year, which was a bizarre headspace to be in for that length of a time. Usually it's for a moment and then you go back to tracking or mixing, but this was just a concentrated stream of releases, which is not a bad thing at all. It's just a unique headspace to be in. But I'm back to tracking a lot. It's, spring and summer always brings up new projects. People kind of get motivated to start working on things they've been thinking about, usually in the spring. I don't know if that's universally true for everybody, but I've experienced that a lot.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of different things about summertime, especially this time of year. For some, it's very busy, and for others, it's festival season.
Right. Sometimes with touring acts, it can be totally dead. And sometimes just being in a city in like July and August, everybody tries to get out of town. So sometimes August is dead. And it's been that way for me in the past. And then this summer is going to be absolutely off the rails. It's crazy busy. So
can you tell us what life was like before studio years? Like, where did you grow up? And did you grow up in a place that had music or a music program, or did your family, were they musically inclined?
My family is musically inclined. I have no actual musicians in my family, but I always kind of tell the story that like both of my parents were just great listeners. I take a lot of inspiration from the fact that my mom just had great taste in like Motown and classic like songwriters and singers. Carole King, I remember driving around in the car listening to like Carole King and like the oldie station and the Beach Boys and even like the old crooners like Bobby Darin and Vic Damone and those guys. That was like always in the house on the radio. And my dad is like a huge music fan, was a big opera fan when I was a kid, a big, huge jazz fan early on back in the day. He's got stories about seeing Billie Holiday playing like Kenmore Square when he was a kid. So I grew up around a lot of really good music, which is an amazing, amazing place to start, an amazing privilege because it just gets your ear going in an interesting way,
Absolutely, yeah.
But no, my grandpa, my mom's father, who was actually her adopted father, he played piano. And so that's the only musician in my family, but he and I aren't actually blood related, but that's why I play piano is he played and I thought it was cool. He was born in the very early part of the 20th century. So he played stride piano, ragtime, like boogie woogie, those kind of styles. He was totally self-taught. And he was, as a kid, I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. So I grew up with that. And that's the big impetus for me having played an instrument was seeing him play.
That's really cool. So what about school? Did you have a music program at school, or what was the arts like?
I didn't have any organized music when I was a kid, except like trying to take piano lessons really early on. My grandpa gave us the upright piano when he moved out of the house he lived in into an apartment later in life. So the piano I saw him playing when I was super, super young, he gave us that upright piano when I was a kid, 5 or 6 years old. And I started taking lessons and I got along with it sort of. And, I didn't begin to enjoy that process until much later, but I stuck with it and took lessons the whole time. But in terms of school music, there was nothing. By the time I was a teenager, I had friends living in the neighborhood who played guitar, played drums, and we had a really mediocre garage band, literally a garage band in my friend's garage in the summertime, playing, trying to learn Beatles covers and stuff. My buddy Jay, who did that actually, is now a session guitar player in Nashville. So it's really funny how that what could have otherwise just been two like suburban kids playing is that we both became professionals, which is weird. But at the time, he just played guitar in church, and I was just like taking rudimentary piano lessons, and neither of us knew anything. So I think back on that, and I was like, well, that's a good way to develop your ear. I think I remember, him and I trying to figure out, like, how do people sing harmony? Like, how do the Beatles sing harmony? What is that? How do people sing together? Because you don't know. Right. 7, 8, 12 years old, you have no idea. And us doing it terribly, like anything else, the doing it badly was the best way to figure out how to do it correctly at some point. I'm not sure we ever got to correctly at that stage of the game. And thankfully, this is like before you could easily home record yourself, because this is in the 80s. So I don't think there's a lot of documentation of how I imagine how bad that was, but we had patient parents back in the day let us, make a bunch of noise in their basement or their garage. But there was no organized music education aside from me taking piano lessons when I was a kid.
And how did you make the transition from musician to recording, like recording yourself or recording your band's music? Or
it was a very, very slow and gradual process. So I stayed with it, got way more into studying music in high school, and then in college I studied liberal arts, but also went to New England Conservatory and studied composition. I played jazz. By that time, I'd been in a couple of bands and sort of started doing the thing. And it's really in college that I started messing around with the cassette 4-tracks. And like, I was always I think back on it now, I was always the guy, if we had the gig in like, the house show venue, I was always the guy like setting up the PA. I always had like a passing interest in that stuff and a little bit of knowledge about how things worked. But I was not really into math and science when I was a kid, which is funny because I had no predilection for a lot of the stuff that nowadays is necessary, knowing about how to repair things or any of that. I wish I had paid more attention.
Was there ever this sort of light bulb moment where you thought to yourself, okay, this is the track that I'm on, this is exactly what I should be doing, and you just kind of went in that direction?
There was never a specific light bulb moment, I don't think. I just always kind of slowly flowed into that direction, recording myself out of necessity, recording my friends' bands once I got good enough that they knew that this was a thing I did. And even then, I remember well into my 20s, it was like dragging gear into someone's house and like setting it up makeshift overnight and, trying to put something together that sounded like anything, not having any idea what I was doing.
What about your first experience doing it professionally?
My first exposure to doing it for real, doing anything in audio for real, was working live sound, which I did like on college radio back in the day, and then in like smaller venues. And then eventually I worked my way up to be a live sound engineer in clubs in Boston, in Cambridge, like TT the Bears, and the Middle East. And I started out there kind of in over my head, not really knowing what I was doing. I was still a musician at the time, it was my early 20s, but I wanted to get a sort of a foot in that world and thought I would be able to do it. And I think that was a great just proving ground for learning. A lot of people in the audio world spend a lot of time. I think you see it sometimes. It's funny to me when you see it on videos, when you see it on educational videos and people are just kind of like sweeping around with an EQ. And that's perfectly legitimate to go and sort of see what the EQ does or to find resonances or whatever. But I remember being in over my head working in live sound with like feedback happening and having to know where to grab on the 31 band graphic EQ at the front house desk. And I was like, that's a good way to learn your frequencies. It's not always that kind of cause-specific issue. You're not in the studio being like, I really have to notch out 3.15K right now. But it's a good way to learn where things are and what things do, especially when you're a kid doing this and you're working in less than ideal rooms and playing, house show venues and just kind of trying to set stuff up and learning why stuff works and why feedback happens and what gain structure is. Fundamentals that you don't think of at the time that you're realizing that you're learning, the fundamentals that later on you look back and you're like, yeah, that was a trial by fire. That was cool.
A few weeks ago, I worked a community arts and music festival where they had a rented console set up with a PA system and monitors in the sanctuary of a Unitarian church. And because, a known person in town that kind of knows about this stuff, they just rented the equipment and had asked me if I knew anybody who would run it. So I said I would go ahead and run it. And I don't think I've done a live event similar to this for quite a long time, but I was familiar with all of the equipment. It was like a Yamaha analog mixer and a like fairly basic PA setup with monitors, a couple of DIs, but it was literally like every different kind of act throughout the day that you could imagine. There was an a cappella group, there was 2 singer-songwriters, there was a funk band, there was a Bollywood rock and roll band, and having to adapt this system that I did not know very well to each one of these situations on the fly. Yeah, talk about trial by fire. That's definitely how it felt. But at the end of the day, I got through everything. I had to troubleshoot a few things, problem solve a few things that I was familiar with because of working in the studio every day. So it really wasn't like a huge jump, but I could feel the seconds pass by way more than I've ever felt that in the studio. So you were working in live sound before you opened the studio. Tell me what your live sound experience was like.
I was a musician. I was working just retail jobs, and then I was a musician, and I was also working live sound. And I ended up working live sound for almost a decade. The entire time I was always in bands, playing in bands that were legit enough to record in studios, and also just playing in bands where I was still doing the 4-track cassette recording or eventually stepped it up to half-inch 8-track, reel-to-reel recording, analog recording. But cassette was always like my first love. Still love cassette recording. And the live sound thing just kind of led me to more legitimate kind of opportunities, touring opportunities as a front of house guy and touring opportunities as a musician. I got the chance to work in a bunch of studios and slowly got the bug for studio recording and sort of had a sense maybe I can take all the stuff that I didn't realize I knew from home recording and apply it to this world of studio recording. It just felt like a mysterious kind of non-accessible place when I was just a kid, when I was kind of punk rock and just recording people in house basements and stuff. It didn't feel accessible kind of in a way. So Early studio experiences were really informative to me because it was like, oh, this is just people doing the same thing with a much greater level of legitimacy on all fronts. The mic stands aren't like held together by elastic band and stuff, you know what I mean?
Had you had a semi-permanent space before the space you have now?
Not particularly, no. I had recorded in practice spaces. I've had the sort of misfortune to have a rental practice space in the Boston area, all over in a bunch of different facilities. But in those spaces, I always sort of rigged up home recording setups. And I had worked in a lot of studios. I was really, really lucky to work in Brighton in a studio right on the Alston-Brighton line in a studio called Analog Divide back in the early 2000s. And that was run by the guys from Black Helicopter. Tim Shea, who's a guitarist and vocalist in Black Helicopter. That was a space that someone had built it out in the 70s or maybe 80s. And it was very dead. It had been framed out, very DIY, very, very dead. Had a really tiny little narrow control room. And the guys from Black Helicopter built a really great weird little analog room called Analog Divide in there. And they had a 16-track Otari machine that I own to this day that I later purchased from them. And they had, I think it was a Soundcraft board, a couple of tannoy monitors, which is the reason that I've got tannoys up there. And it was the sort of, it was just your basic small, built in the tradition of like the 80s and 90s kind of small studio. They had all the requisite stuff, but only as much as they needed. And they made great records in there, like really stellar records in there. I started working with them around the time they were working on a record for Thurston Moore's label Ecstatic Peace. They were making an album for that label called Invisible Jet. That was sort of their first real, like, hey, let's do it for real, as opposed to going somewhere else to make the record. They were like, let's make the record we're going to make, but do it ourselves. And I was kind of a catch-all, like, assistant engineer for them. It started out with just me sort of hanging around and bothering them. I had done live sound for them a bunch of times, so I knew them, but I had no real studio experience except for things that I had done on my own, which I didn't think counted until I was in the studio and realized, I got a little bit of this information just from things I've experienced myself, which is a great way to remember, because I feel like I remember this really bizarre occasion I had back in the day to solve this particular problem that we're now encountering. Maybe I could try to solve this problem here now. And it's great when you're in a welcoming environment, because Tim, who ran the studio, was very open to me just kind of jumping in where I could. And there was no real hierarchy of like, I'm the pro and you're the assistant. He was very down for me to jump in as much as I sort of felt I could contribute.
So tell me about the place you are now. What is kind of the history of the space, and how did you get in there? How did you find it? How did you set it up?
So we found this place on Craigslist, actually, which is a miracle to talk about in this day and age, finding decent commercial realty in this city on Craigslist. But my friend Patrick and I, at the time, I mean 2005, were in a band called Keys to the Streets of Fear, and we gigged and we toured a little bit. We were a very loud, weird, confrontational kind of band. We wanted to record live to 2-track. For some reason, even though the music was not jazz, we loved old jazz records. And we're like, man, let's just get the sound of the thing the way we do it, just exactly. No mixing and all this stuff. I had had some studio experience by that point, and the other guys in the band had been musicians for a little while. They had had other recording experiences with other bands that were less than enjoyable. Remember in 2005, everybody's experience in the last few years of that had been sitting around while the computer crashes, especially if you're not working in an ultra legit studio, which those of us who were broken in small indie bands at the time had never worked in an ultra legit studio. We had all worked. I had a lucky experience in Analog Divide, but we had all worked in small places that were kind of cobbled together, and, there was a little left lacking. With that band, we said, hey, let's record ourselves for real, live to 2-track, no mixing, no nonsense. And at the time, I looked around, and I could not find a place in Boston to record live to 2-track. I couldn't find anyone who wanted to do it. First of all, I couldn't find most anybody with a tape machine. And second of all, the folks I did speak to were reticent, very, very reluctant to do it. Didn't really want to hear my whole spiel about why it made sense. And I just felt kind of like, well, that was a waste of time. We went to New York. We had friends in a band called the Walkmen, and they ran a studio called Marcata, which was in Harlem at the time. The building was later taken by Columbia University, but at the time it was a big old Nash Rambler car factory at like 129th, 128th Street. We went down there and recorded live to 2-track, and that record came out crazy. We put out a couple singles, 7-inch record and everything. And that just came out insane, and we sounded nuts, and we loved it. It was perfect. It was what we wanted to do. And the engineer was cooperative. This guy named Kevin McMahon, who was great. He didn't get our music at all. He just was like, yeah, you psychos want to record live to 2-track with singing through guitar amps and stuff? Sure. And that was a really kind of eye-opening experience because Marcata was, again, built by musicians, built by creative people, pretty small. They only had one of everything, and some of that stuff was held together with duct tape. But if they only had one of everything, they made sure to buy the best. They built the space to make music they wanted to make, and it was a really inspiring environment to create in, and there was no real technical concerns working with Kevin, where I just kind of was defaulted to becoming the person explaining to the engineer what we wanted. And he was amenable to it, and that was great for, me being in my early 20s and expecting a fight from some older guy who probably thought we were crazy, but, he didn't express that, He expressed it later. He and I became friends, and he expressed that later. But that band had grown. We had decided to add, I was playing keyboards then. We decided to add some stuff to that music that mandated that multi-tracking made sense. We went back and did it there again, and it was amazing. We came back to Boston. We finished that record at both Analog Divide and at Wellspring Sound out in Acton. And that was the period in time when Patrick and I started talking about we should have our own space. And it was not the conversation about we should build a commercial facility. It was that we should have our own space to do this kind of thing. We had seen those kinds of spaces that were built to a professional degree, but still built by working musicians on the cheap, DIY, to achieve the specific goal they were trying to achieve at the time. We were like, well, we're not the Walkmen. We've got a thing going on, and we'd like to do our thing, and I'd like to work with some of the people I might like to work with if possible. So we went looking for a space. We found this space that is now the Soul Shop on Craigslist. This is in Medford. And our landlord was like, no way. Musicians? The hell are you talking about? No way. And we had to go back to him a couple times, and he's a sweetheart. He's an old Italian guy like us, and we talked him into it. The piano building that was here before had been here for 100 years. The building itself is, I think, about 140 years old. I don't know the exact date, but it was a horse carriage barn way, way, way back in the day. And then it was an antique warehouse. And then my landlord's grandfather purchased the building in the early 1940s, and the building was framed out, and the interior was put together in 1948. And that's the same floor that we're walking on here today. Was beechwood floor laid in 1948. And it was a piano shop for all of the 20th century. And when we found the situation, my landlord was downsizing because the piano retail was not what it used to be. The retail in the front became a different store. He had no use for a lot of space, because if you're working on multiple 9-foot grands at the same time, you need a lot of space. If you're not, then you don't. So he wanted to downsize to get rid of about 1,000 square feet in the middle of the building. And he didn't want some no-good musicians up in here till all hours of the morning, but that was 15 years ago, and we're still here. So it worked out okay.
How serendipitous it was for you to find a space that was so perfectly aligned with the way that you wanted to work, but also kind of match your aesthetics for a recording studio.
I understand how absolutely just unicorn it was to find commercial space that was accessible to us and affordable to us within the city, even back then. And that was 2007. That we started thinking about building the place. We found the space in 2007. We built the interior of the studio in what I, at the time, considered the hottest summer I had ever experienced in my life. Perhaps it was because that during August, I was not outdoors enjoying the world. I was in an attic in a 140-year-old building, laying that pink insulation down. That stuff that's itchy? Woo! So, an attic in a barn-style building. If it's like 80 degrees outside, it's like 95, 100 degrees in the air. It was hectic. We did everything ourselves. We enlisted some friends to help with some drywall and ripping stuff out. My buddy Patrick had worked as a contractor, so he had a lot of experience and had a sense of what he wanted to do in here. There was not enough room to really build more than not enough space to build more than a couple rooms. We had talked about it initially. My only goal was to build a very big, very good sounding live room. Simply put, there was nowhere at the time when we had looked to record ourselves. There was nowhere in Boston that I could go and record a tape in a nice big room that wasn't $1,000 a day back then. So count that for inflation now. So at the time, wanting to build the biggest, best sounding live room possible, that's all we prioritized. We built a very large, what I would consider very wonderful sounding live room. We built a small control room, and that's it. At the time, there was no space for really anything else, and built it ourselves. We did hire a legitimate electrician, because you don't mess around with that kind of stuff. A lot of the rest of the infrastructure was here. There was already plumbing and such. But the studio itself we built, and that's it. I'm sitting in that control room today.
Is there anything special or unique about the place as far as the improvements that you've made to the building?
Well, when we first built the place, I mentioned it was really just me, the band I was in at the time, myself, my friend Patrick, who I built it with, working on our own stuff. And that band ran its course. We had other people practicing in here, sort of shouldering the burden a little bit. But after a couple of years, it very quickly became obvious it was just my responsibility to work here if I wanted to make it into something. We started off with no gear at all, like really next to nothing. We bought a console early on. We were very lucky to find a really great Neotech console that was for sale locally, which was a miracle. And then again, I bought a tape machine. I said before that Analog Divide used to own a 16-track tape machine. I had accrued gear over the years, but it was a very small amount. Just some microphones, a little bit of outboard gear. So we started with not very much. And I felt a little self-conscious hanging out a shingle, advertising us as a commercial facility when, there was only one of everything, and not one of everything, but the options were minimal. And it's been really important to me over the years to build the space and equip the space such that everything that's here works. Everything that's here is available to whoever's working here. I was always incredibly frustrated back in the day working at a studio where they might have a tape machine, but you could tell it hadn't been turned on in 6 months. And if it hasn't been turned on in 6 months, then it hasn't been calibrated probably in 2 years. And no slight on any other engineers that I was working with, but if, their reluctance to want to work with tape told me everything I needed to know. I specifically wanted to work on tape back in the day. We're now hybrid. I have Pro Tools as well. I still work on tape all the time. Pro Tools came about in 2015. I was working on a film score that I did that I had to score it to picture, and I couldn't work on tape for that. That had also been kind of a moment of there was work I didn't want to say no to. That was much better done on Pro Tools. Also, back in the day as a keyboard player, you'd go into places and they'd tell you like, it's besides the studio cost, it's another $75 to tune the piano if you want to use it. If you tell me that the piano's only getting tuned when the client wants to use it, then that means that you don't care about the health and well-being of that piano.
Right.
And as a piano player, pianos are living things, and the tuning of a piano relates to its maintenance and not just to the execution of somebody working on it at a given point in time. It relates to its well-being over years. We have several pianos here. Very lucky to own a 1926 Steinway M, which is my pride and joy. That piano has been on a million recordings. I also own a 1946 Wurlitzer that our landlord was able to find for us for very little. That's just your average living room piano. And that thing's been on a million records. It's important to me that if somebody comes in and wants to use a piece of gear, that it's available to them, that it's functional, and there's no excuses involved in it. That does lead to a lot of work with maintenance and keeping up with things. I've always found it better to own a little bit less stuff, fewer items, but to have them really count, to have them be really versatile for a lot of different styles. Of course, there's things you need to have that are specialty items, but somebody comes in and sees something they want to work with, it's available to them. And if somebody comes in and throws me a curveball as an engineer, I feel like it's necessary for me to have a lot of, arrows in the quiver. Over time, building the space out and acquiring gear, the point of that has really just been, what needs am I trying to satisfy? What work am I trying to do? And what have I learned from the last project where I really wish I'd had this thing that has now, prompted me to go out and try to get that thing. In 2019, Patrick and I were thinking about trying to do an expansion. We took over a little bit of extra space in the building, and we were talking about building a new control room, which would have also allowed us to reconfigure our current space to have a lounge and a little more just storage and tech space. COVID kind of quashed that idea. It'll happen someday, but over time, getting the most out of the space as it is has been really important to me because, again, I started this thing wanting to have a nice, big, beautiful live room to record acoustic instruments in, and I've gone and done a lot of other things that aren't that. That itself has always been really important to my workflow. It's ironic now that, especially with home recording and COVID and everything else, it's all the more important to me to have that acoustic space and to have the ability to reamp, to have the ability to put things back into the air. I've worked on a lot of really great records that were recorded in people's apartments and basements and garages since COVID. And it's, for me, it's like a return to, how I was working 20 years ago with the knowledge that I have now and the gear that I have now and the sort of experience that I can bring to it. I think it actually makes it more important that one of the things I can bring to the table is the sense of unity, bringing some life to the proceedings by combining sounds in the same room, bringing together, a lot of small home recorded digital sounding things into a broader, kind of bigger, 3D, juicier sounding analog landscape. That's become very necessary. I think people complain about home recording as though it's taking something away from engineers, professional engineers and producers. I don't see that at all. I think it's made our job more important. I know plenty of musicians who, having had the experience during COVID of recording, producing, and mixing themselves, would love to never have to do that again. I've seen some people also really take to it, which is encouraging because, not to sound like the old guy, but like now with a copy of GarageBand that you got with your computer. I mean, I know it takes the money to buy the computer in the first place, but once you've done that, the copy of GarageBand you got for free and a microphone you can buy for less than, a few dollars, you can achieve recordings on that level now that it was really a struggle 20 years ago to make that kind of thing happen. And the sort of urgency that compelled me back then to sort of starting getting into cassette recording and trying to learn what things were and how do I plug stuff into other stuff? What even is this? That learning curve has been narrowed if you want it. It's not available to everyone. You do have to do a little research and you have to go and roll with it and make some mistakes like anything else. But I think it's very encouraging that the distance between desiring to get into it and being able to actually get into it is so much shorter now than it was back when at least when I started out,
One of the things I've observed that I'm absolutely elated about is how many more remote jobs I get now where people aren't using GarageBand, but they're using Logic or they're using Reaper or they're using some of these other DAWs, which have, a steeper learning curve. And they're fully embracing the idea of pre-production, not just writing songs and then sending them to somebody to mix or going into a studio to kind of figure things out. They are taking the initiative to do this on their own. A lot of them still need help. Definitely I don't see my job going away anytime soon. But it's a whole new world now in the after times.
Also, I think it also correlates to the fact that now we're experiencing people who grew up with specifically Apple Mac facility. So the no pun intended logical step, if you have access to GarageBand and you've grown up always being comfortable in that software, using a DAW is not this kind of arcane, crazy mountain to climb the way it might have been for guys like us, or guys like me at least. Having not even gotten into digital recording since 2015, I still think of myself as kind of a caveman.
That's where
it could differ.
Was it?
But you got to remember back in the day, I had a lot of experiences back in the day watching like the Digio 3 crash. And being like, man, I'm never doing this. Last I checked, my tape machine doesn't crash, motherfucker. That was just me being a cocky kid. One of the reasons that I love working analog. But again, now being able to work digitally, if you're dealing with a generation of folks who are very facile with technology and where even using a slightly more advanced DAW like Logic is not a deal breaker, all you're going to do is get better experiences with people on their end and better recordings for us to mix and produce on our end. It's great for everybody.
Absolutely.
And especially now, given the circumstances, I've got friends who are, my age, I'm 44. I've got friends who are, I would call them Luddites, or if not Luddites, then reluctant, not super familiar with technology, who have now, bought a $99 interface and a couple microphones. And it's like, yeah, now I can send a track to my buddy who, plays steel guitar and he can cut something and send it back to me. And that was not possible 5-10 years ago. And very thankful for that. So it's people, because I started the Soul Shop all analog and because we were all analog for about a decade and because news travel's slow for some reason, people still sort of think that I'm analog or that because I've worked analog because I'm think that maybe I'm kind of, crotchety about it or kind of, not into all the stuff. That is not the case in any regard. People are always surprised when they find out what I do and how I actually work. The reason being is that I didn't look at analog as a situation where it was exclusionary and this is the old way. I have to stick to the old way. It was just the way I wanted to work because there was nobody in 2005 that could tell me if I wanted to work on 16-track, the 16-track digital recording available to me at that price point in 2005 sounded better than 16-track analog recording because it didn't, full stop. That's not the case anymore. And that's wonderful. That's a better situation that I would prefer to be in. I'm not sitting here pining for the days of like, I really wish the Digio 2 still sounded bad so that we didn't have to work on the computer. I love working on the computer. It allows me to make the music I want to make. You know?
Absolutely.
And I still work on tape when that's part of the thing that allows me to make the music I want to make that way. I will do that because that's better for the music. That's the only reason. That's the only motivation.
It feels like you might think that people have some misconceptions about you and your space.
I think people look at a commercial recording facility as though it's kind of a little bit of an ivory tower, like it's this big sort of thing that is not immediately accessible and it's only available once you decide to pay a ton of money. You know, even people who still think it's only accessible to like pro, air quotes, pro musicians or artists or whatever. And it's like, we're not living in the world where the label pays for the studio for a brand new artist most of the time, some of the time, but not most of the time, not most of us. That wasn't my first experience. And I don't think it's most people's, but under the circumstances with me, I've been privileged to work on a lot of records where it's either somebody's first time making a record on this level, or it's somebody's experience making a record that they want to make, as opposed to having worked in other studios, being put in places they didn't want to be, or having to work in ways they didn't enjoy. And I think a huge misconception is that when you come into a certain space, you're just kind of obliged to go with whatever the person who runs the space is going to do. And that is the polar opposite of the circumstance. I worked in live sound for a long time. I worked in the service industry for a long time. What we do is a service job. And when I've trained people, when I've had interns or assistants, one of the metaphors I always use, again, this is becoming a little hackneyed because I've said it in other interviews, but I'll say it again. If you're a bartender and you make the world's greatest margarita, like the greatest margarita on the planet, and someone comes in and orders a gin and tonic, you don't try to bully them into a margarita. You just make them a fucking gin and tonic, and you make them the best gin and tonic you can possibly make. And that's it. And there's a notion with engineering, because it's often true, that people are going to force their ideas on you. People are going to try to change your music. People are going to try to mold you into a specific box that is the style in which they work. Just because I have preferences as an engineer and as a musician and as a listener doesn't mean that I think all music should work like that or sound like that. And clearly, I don't think all music should be made one way, because that's nonsense. I'm not going to record a beat-based electronic record the same way I'm going to record a live piano jazz trio, the same way I'm going to record an acoustic singer-songwriter with just their voice and their guitar. Those are three different things, all of which I enjoy. And as a professional, I should be able to deal with all those things.
Absolutely.
When someone comes into a commercial facility, I think there's often, and I experienced this as a kid, and I still carry this around with me, so I never want to be like the other guy, the way I was treated sometimes, where you kind of have to fight for your right a little bit, and you have to fight for get your voice heard, and you have to kind of breach this wall of like, well, that's the person with the knowledge and it's my music, and I'm trying to fight for my music to be heard. It's like, the person with the knowledge should not have to be cajoled into respecting your music. If they're not able to discern what your music needs, or if they're not listening to you when you explicitly tell them, then they're the wrong person for the job. And that's the other part of the thing, is that stylistic stuff doesn't point to who the right person's going to be. Some people end up making one kind of form of record a lot. Very lucky to say that that's not been my experience. I haven't tried to get there, and it also just hasn't happened to me, which is great. I would prefer to work on a very diverse, very weird assortment of stylistic stuff. But even if all you did was one very specific genre, doesn't mean it's all that you can do. It can be a choice. And also, when someone's looking to do that style or explore a specific style, the person who's renowned for doing that thing, if you don't get along with them, then that's not the right person for you to work with. It's more about the relationship you have with the person than it is what you think they bring to the table or what they're obliged to bring to the table. And with commercial recording, with paying for a facility, I find a lot of musicians come in here and don't understand that they're in charge. It's not because I'm asking them to do work. It's because I'm deferring to what their music has told me that they are looking for. And I'm deferring to what they explicitly tell me when I ask them certain questions. I'm not going to put the whole burden on them to make all the choices. I'm not going to refer every single decision to them. Ideally, they're expecting me to infer some stuff, to take some stuff on, and to make the technical aspects of the recording process just happen. That stuff should just be in the background. That stuff should not be a conversation with the artist of like, do you like this microphone? If I offer them an option or like an A-B comparison, it should be because there's a necessary piece of information I'm trying to get from the artist. It's not because I need to run all that stuff by them because I don't know. And if I don't know, I might not be the right guy for the job. So I think a lot of people come in with the expectation of like, I'm going to get told what to do. No, absolutely not. And in that circumstance too, with me, I don't want people to assume that I'm just going to make default choices based on my preferences, because that might not be right for what they want. So it's dialogue. A big part of it comes along with talking about this beforehand, because it gets difficult if you're right there in the moment. If you're standing in front of the microphone and, you're hearing your voice back in the headphones and you don't like it. I've been there as a musician, not much as a singer, but as a musician, I've been there, and it's hard to have that conversation. I never specifically had a problem having that conversation because fuck them. They should listen to me if I'm the artist. from the client. But not everybody has that attitude. I really, as the engineer, want to empower the people I work with to have that attitude, or to at least be able to have that dialogue with me, or to know that it's on the table. If it isn't on the table, if they just want to not think about the technical side of the process or not have to really worry about it at all, I should be able to do that for them too. Because what else am I here for? You know what I mean? Like, there is production stuff, there is creative stuff. Sometimes I'm being asked to do that, and sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm just part of the gear, you know, like I'm an actuated person who's kind of also part of the tape machine, but sometimes I'm part of the creative process. And to know that boundary a little is important, but also not to just draw a line in the sand and say, this is all I do, this is whatever. There's a unique thing that happens in the studio where it's one of the only examples in people's lives where they feel like some things can't be discussed or some things are just, they're just rote. They're just, this is how it has to be. Oh, this is the way we're going to work because that's the way this person works. If you're coming in as an artist and paying someone to record you or to produce you or to arrange your music or do whatever, mix your music, whatever it is, there's a way they probably work. There's some things they've learned, just like any job. There's some things you kind of do by rote, and there's some defaults and there's some preferences you have. That's not the only thing, though. That's not the only circumstance. It's not as if each artist doesn't bring something interesting to the table, because I said before, it's a service industry job. Yes. We're not just making the same cheeseburger for everyone, though. And I'm not going to stretch the food metaphor any further because that could get real sloppy real quick. But the bartending metaphor from before is that not everybody cares what's in the cocktail. Some people really care what's in the cocktail. Some people want to tell you how to make the cocktail. All of those things are valid. It's about knowing kind of how to respond to those things and about knowing what will benefit that person's experience. And in our case, in this job, about what benefits the music. So that's a very long-winded way to get around to what I was trying to say, but...
Yeah, but I appreciate that you went into it, because if there's one thing that I hear as a complaint from clients who have worked in other studios, no matter where they are, it is that their expectation for communication was not met, or they were left feeling like they didn't have a say.
I've had that experience as a musician and as a paying customer and as a member of a band. I've had that experience numerous times. And it's one of the reasons I do this job, man.
Yeah, I think people like you and I have that philosophy of always being aware of that because we have been in those situations. And it's very powerful for the client to understand that that's the environment that they're in. I just had a conversation with somebody about this in the last few days. Whenever I hear things like this where they're like, yeah, we went and recorded with this person, or we are in this situation and we are just kind of like in the dark, and they just mixed it and we are in the dark. Yeah. There was I was just like, what? Well, yeah. I couldn't. But I know it happens. Yeah. You want to hear the worst example of the thing here? I'm not going to talk about a specific occasion. I'm going to talk about someone's reaction that was just like an absolute like beacon moment for like, hey, here's what I don't want to be. There's that thing where, as you just said, sometimes the process is going on and it's like, well, they just took the music and they made a bunch of choices and they mixed it or they did whatever, and suddenly it's a different thing and it's not my music anymore. I saw a reaction from someone one time who basically was like, what? You want me to like bring you in on every fucking decision, every single thing I'm doing all the time? No, you're supposed to know which of those things matter. I'm not going to bring someone in on which piece of outboard EQ I'm going to use on their vocal. I'm going to interpret body language and have a conversation about how they're feeling about how their voice is translating, and not necessarily only concern myself with the technical aspects of how that's achieved. I'm not going to put up 5 microphones and ask you, the artist, to pick between them. But ideally, when you come back into the control room and hear playback on take 1, all you're caring about is your performance and not, I think this microphone makes me sound bad or sibilant or whatever the issue. Right. Ideally, I might not have always made the right call right from the beginning, but ideally I've put you in a space where if there's anything that stands out to you, your concern is with the last few % of those things and not with every slogging detail, the minutia of the circumstance. Your concern should be instead, I'm here to deliver a performance. I'm here to get this music translated to the people. I've hopefully enlisted someone who can make the technical aspects of that just vanish into the background and allow me, the artist, to concern myself only with the performance and the execution and the feel. And did I sell the lyric? And did I make that person cry when I hit the big chorus? That kind of stuff, the stuff that actually matters about this job. And a lot of people on our side, just to diss on engineers for a little bit, because I love doing that, a lot of people on our side forget that that's the point. And they get really bogged down in the minutia, and they get really bogged down and like, well, I'm just trying to do my job over here. It's like, yeah, we all respect that you're technically very adept at your job. That is a baseline level of consideration.
Once you've hit that, it no longer freaking matters. Now all we're concerned with is how good you made the artist feel. Now that's literally all we're judging you on. Yes.
Disagree more.
I'm glad you own all those whatever pieces of gear. Did that get that song across correctly? Because if not, then it ain't the gear, buddy.
Right.
You know.
Absolutely.
So the Soul Shop has been open since 2007. How do you think the landscape of recording studios in the city of Boston has changed since you guys opened?
Well, the landscape of recording studios is definitely different. It's not night and day different. Because when I look back on the music scene that we had, for example, in 2007 versus the music scene we have now, there was a much more active, much more diverse music scene back then, which is unfortunate to say because you always want to look at the past and then think about progress. And there's a lot of progress going on, but that's not one area of progress that we've seen in this region specifically. We've lost a lot of good musicians more than we've gained. And I think that relates to cost of living. That relates on a lot of other stuff that might be outside the scope of our current conversation, but which I could go on the screed about very intensely if you wanted me to. The studio environment, I think, has not changed drastically. I don't specifically know why we've persevered. I think the reason we persevered is that there's no way I was going to let it fail. I did not intend to start this out as a commercial facility. When we started it out, it was just us working in here ourselves, recording ourselves. It was a practice space for us and a couple of our friends' bands. It slowly grew into a commercial facility. I still worked other jobs for the first many, many years of its existence. Yeah, it's really just me needing a space to do the things that I want to do. Yeah, COVID almost killed it. I went into a lot of debt to keep it open, and that's just a necessity because what else am I going to do? I think there's still great studio experiences to be had in Boston, and there's a lot of places I really actually honestly love to work. We've had a couple of really unfortunate closures, and then we've also had the horrible, horrible incident of Zippa having the fire burning down. That was tragic.
For those who aren't familiar, Zippa Recording was a well-known and respected recording studio owned and operated by producer-engineer Brian Charles.
And that studio was there for 30 years, 35 years. Tragic fire, yeah. But Brian's back. Brian's back doing his thing. He's building a new space in Cambridge, I think. The sort of circumstantial issue, cost of living and gentrification has forcibly closed a few studios in this town. But at least the people my generation and younger, I'm encouraged by what I see. There's amazing stuff going on in this region. So yeah, so we have lost a few spaces. Q Division is a great example of resilience because even though they went out of their Davis Square location, they've now built a gorgeous new space on Ringe Ave in Cambridge. So that did qualify as a studio closure, but is now another studio opening. I'm really encouraged compared to when we built the shop, compared to that population. I'm really encouraged by people, our generation, my generation and younger. The unfortunately now closed Pink Noise, run by Dan Thorne in Somerville, was an amazing space run by younger folks and built, again, totally DIY. Blackheart Sound in Manchester. There's a bunch of places. I didn't know you in 2007 doing your thing, running your space. So there are more, I think, there's more connection among people. When I say back then also that I was looking around for studios and I kind of couldn't find a place to record, I also got kind of a frosty reception. And it was later from people that I ended up meeting and getting to know. For example, one of the studios I looked at was Q Division. I didn't talk to Rafi. I don't know who I spoke to. I think I talked to a receptionist. I probably called the Q Division record label back then, not the studio, because I didn't know what I was doing. But I've come to know Rafi Sofer at Q Division and Ed Velasquez, and I cannot name two nicer, more welcoming, helpful dudes in the music industry who have always been super encouraging about me and this place. Really, really early days of the Soul Shop, I was on some insanely big mix session for me, like something bigger than I had ever done. And we have a Bantam patch bay, TT cables, tiny telephone cables, in this console, in our Neotech console. And I ran out of patch cables. And I'm sitting there okay, this is an amateur mistake. And I try not to make amateur mistakes. I try to make sure that there's a backlog of spares of extra batteries and light bulbs and everything in the closet. And there wasn't anything spare in the patch bay department. So I went on Facebook and I was like, man, anybody happen to have any patch cables I can borrow for an emergency session? Ed Velasquez writes me, he's like, I'm leaving Q Division right now. How many you need? And I was like, three or four. It was legit, 3 or 4. He's like, I'm driving by. I have to drive by your place to go home. I'll stop by. And you roll by. He didn't even get out of the car. He pulls in the lot and just sticks his hand out the driver's side window with 40 patch cables. And he's like, get him back to me later on. It's like, thank you, Ed. Saved my ass.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. So there is a lot of camaraderie among the people that do this. And there have been studios that went out. Analog Divide that I spoke of earlier that I worked at, they closed that space. That building was demolished. That was the same building the Kissy Pig used to be in. That was the same building my buddy Dan Gonzalez had a space in there in Alston. There have been a lot of places that have gone, but there's been more. The more that have opened have been on the DIY side of things, which I think is beneficial to the community because the investment of the people that make it is more palatable, and it translates into what the space is like. And hopefully it translates into the experience of working at the space, whatever that place might be, for the people who work there.
Have you seen any improvement in the amount of rehearsal space or workspaces for musicians in the city?
To be honest with you, I haven't seen much in the way of rehearsal spaces, practice spaces, or available workspace for musicians in this town, honestly, at all. I know there's some movements going on to have the city involve itself in real estate for that. And I just hope that it does not become controlled by city government or, wading deep into the bureaucracy is not the way to
absolutely
inspire a creative environment at all. I think it is really wonderful to see a return to stages and a return to live shows and a little bit of a return to maybe not what it was like before COVID, but I don't want to sound like one of those people that's like in the before times because that gets old real fast. But looking forward, I've been very, very encouraged to see just down the street here in Medford, Deep Cuts Deli finally achieving what they've been trying to do for years. Ian from Deep Cuts was doing pop-ups for a long time. He's doing this cool idea that live music and really good sandwiches can go hand in hand. And I think a lot of people thought he was crazy, just like people probably thought I was nuts starting a commercial space back then. They've had the ability with Deep Cuts to now, they used to have a sandwich shop in West Medford, but now to build a 240 cap venue here in Medford Square that still does, sandwiches during the day, that also has a brewery in-house and is hosting not only music, but DJs. They're doing some comedy shows. They're doing all kinds of stuff. I believe they're trying to make it all ages. I'm not sure if that's every single event, but they're trying to do a lot of all ages stuff, which is cool. It's really great to see. And again, that's not people coming in with venture capital money and going insane. That's people that are invested in this scene, that have been here for a minute, that have tried to do this thing, that have built it themselves. And that to me is the most encouraging thing, because it's not, I could go on again, just reserving going on the streets about gentrification and about income inequality right now, but it's not people buying up real estate in Somerville. It's not heirs and heiresses buying up real estate in Union Square, which we could talk about in specific, but I won't do that. It's good to see, especially when it's relating to this music community that has now been abandoned by so many people, seeing it embraced by the people who really want to be here and really want to work to make it into something.
Before we finish, are there any exciting projects or collaborations that you're working on, or anything that's coming up in the future that you want to talk about?
Oh, man. There's a bunch of records. I'm always hesitant to talk about the things I'm right now working on because you never know when stuff's going to be released. I will mention I'm waiting on a return on a mastering job on a record I did with a songwriter named Adam White, singer-songwriter. He and I worked on this record for legit years. It's an amazing record of songs, but in the tradition of great songwriters who write about sketchy characters and unreliable narrators. He's put together an amazing collection of music. He let me kind of take the reins on production. I'm very proud of that record, and hopefully that'll be out later this year. And there's been a lot of different kinds of stuff. I worked with a drummer from Massachusetts named Michelle Tucker. She's got a few different songs coming out from a session we did, but this is jazz recorded live in the room. It was mixed, but I'll tell you, that mix was really just me kind of balancing the elements the way they sounded on the day we recorded. She's got a single out now called Both Can Be True, which is a gorgeous ballad. I've got a record with a band called The Caverns from Flagstaff, Arizona that just dropped. I produced it with them, and I added a bunch of keyboards and synthesizers and field recordings and weird stuff on my end. We collaborated over the phone and over Zoom trying to do this thing. They're a duo. One gentleman plays pedal steel and sings. The other guy plays bass, and they've been performing in the world for years and years and years, but they've never really made a record like this. That record's out now. The Caverns, the album's called Like the Winter. A unique experience co-producing with somebody who's 2,000 miles away. Exclusively remote, and then I mixed it here at the Soul Shop myself. Guitar player David Hinckley, who I've worked with a bunch over the years. Instrumental music, it's somewhere in between R&B, jazz fusion, funk. It's hard to define. He's got a record out called Purity Supreme. He, again, recorded that himself at home.
Elio DeLuca from the Soul Shop in Medford, Massachusetts. I want to say thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Of course, I'm really grateful for you being here and having this conversation with me.
Thank you.
And I think that a lot of people are going to really find this very insightful and informative, and I can't wait to talk to you again.
Well, I really hope so.